Welcome, everybody, to The Broken Brain. This is the first ever installment of a new segment that I like to call Fan with an E, or the analysis of some of the underpinnings and issues that are going on within the Netflix program, and with an E. The latest, I think latest reboot of Anne of Green Gables, the great novel, the great miniseries, the great. I say I think because there was another one that came out around the same time. And I don't remember anything other than I saw a bit of the first, and it was President Bartlett, Martin Sheen, there we go, was playing Matthew. And then we can get into that. But anyway, I'm joined by Dalin Rowell, who is just an international jet setter, tastemaker, content guru. No, I'll let you introduce yourself, and you've got some cooler, more realistic credentials than that. You actually do stuff.
I mean, I love all those names. I should put that on my resume. Absolutely. So thank you for that. Yeah. So hi, my name is Dalin. I am a freelance writer / film pundit. I write for /film and a bunch of other websites that you might have seen my name on, and I love movies, TV, and with an E.
We came across each other in the Paprika Facebook group. Those of you that listen to the show know, of course, Daryl's been on the show before. Daryl Mansell's wonderful Facebook group. One of the, I guess I'd say maybe safest, funnest examples of fandom in a Facebook group that I've ever seen. Non-toxic. If you're toxic, they'll kick you out. So if you're listening to this and you're toxic, don't sign up, but you might want to check it out. So I kind of put the call out on Paprika, knowing that there's fans of every kind of medium that you can think of, and you were nice enough to respond. I really enjoy this show, and with an E, and we're going to get into all the different things that they do with the storytelling. I thought it might be fun just briefly to touch on what kind of experiences we may have had with Anne of Green Gables and Anne of Avonlea and all the different things. Mm-hmm. And to kind of talk about maybe what that means to us. What about for you? What was your first exposure to Anne of Green Gables?
So I got into Anne of Green Gables because my mom was a big collector and proprietor of VHS tapes of anime that was made in the late 70s and early 80s that she would get from places like Blockbuster, the library, and also bootleg stores in Chinatown in the New York City area.
Cool.
And there was an anime series called, I think it was Akage no An is the way you say it in Japanese. And there is a series of literature adaptations made by Nippon Television that is called their Masterpiece Theater series. And Akage no An was one of them.
I've never heard of this. This is wild.
Yeah. So that's how I got exposed to Little Women, how I got exposed to Heidi of the Alps, how I got exposed to, obviously, Anne of Green Gables and all those classic literature stuff. They are primarily really famous for an adaptation of Dog of Flanders, which a lot of people grew up with around our age. So, but Anne of Green Gables was what I grew up with a very bad bootleg that was not in good condition, all in Japanese with very limited, shitty subtitles. So,
oh, that's wild. Yeah, I'm going to have to try to track this down. I don't know if it streams anywhere, but we'll have to see.
You can find it in the corners of the internet for sure. And the opening sequence is a vibe. So you should watch that at least.
Okay. Yeah. Special. Even here we are doing a special episode, and I want to plan another special episode for that. We'll see if it comes up. That's interesting because my exposure was, and I think I saw the miniseries first, but I also read the book Anne of Green Gables when I was younger. But they used to, of course, always plug that for a pledge break on PBS, right?
Oh,
yeah, those who are used to that. They'd show all of the miniseries of Anne of Green Gables, and then they'd come on, of course, and be like, it's programming like this that makes PBS, which I don't get me wrong, I actually really enjoy PBS for that reason.
Same.
Not just for that reason, but for lots of reasons, the programming and stuff. But yeah, the pledge break was always kind of fun because they have people who have to vamp through all this time and get you to donate. If you donate $100, we give you a tote bag or something like that. The resurgence seemed to come at the same time. There's a lot of parallel thought in film production and TV production. And so when Anne with an E came out, then the other new one, which I can't remember what it's called. It was just Anne or something.
I think it was Anne of Green Gables, something like that. But yeah, and that was also on PBS, I believe.
I did not catch that one other than, like I said, the first few minutes. And Martin Sheen was in the middle of a monologue, which to me was a little bit of a departure from the Matthew that I'd seen. I will tell you, I went into both seeing that and also watching Anne with an E with oh man, you've got Colleen Dewhurst and Matthew Farnes, I think is the name, who just played those characters so wonderfully. I was like, there's no way. And I'll just say it. I think they knocked it out of the park with this reboot as far as the casting. I think it's fantastic.
Oh, it's absolutely amazing. And I'm going to butcher her whole name, but Amy Macbeth, the girl that plays Anne, is absolutely incredible. Like, truly, the casting in the show is top notch from top to bottom.
I was so excited to see her cast in Stranger Things. And she's in it like 2 times for like a minute each or something like that. And I'm sure she'll play a bigger role in the next season, but I really hope she does.
My goodness, does she look like Ringwald?
Yeah, I hadn't placed that, but that's true. Now that you say that, that's a good energy to bring to Stranger Things.
I agree. And also Anne with the knee, because I think Anne has a lot of qualities of many of Wald's characters in the John Hughes sphere, of standing out and whatnot.
Oh, absolutely. Well, let's get in now to talking about this. I mean, first of all, one of the things that I think people find to be different, and I think if you're going to do a reboot of any kind, you want to make it your own. You want to make it your own art, your own creation. At least that's, I've never made one, but that's what I think. And one of the things that hit me right away was, first of all, it's a series, right? So they have more time with the subject matter than just the miniseries that has a fair amount of time, but not as much, I don't think. And one of the things that I notice is that it has some more serious overtones, that it deals with issues of trauma and issues that Anne would be running into in IRL, in the world. And so I guess I don't know if darker is the right thing, but I guess you could say heavier in some areas. That's at least my first impression.
Yeah, I would say heavier is a good word, but I would more use personally the word modern. I think it's a lot more, cognizant of what are current issues in our world, especially with women. And that's what really drove me to the show, while also being a great juxtaposition of beautiful kind of country core, aesthetic, Pinterest vibes with really intellectual storytelling. And I think that's why this version is the one that sticks the most with me out of any other one I've ever seen.
Well, you're right. It does touch on some of the modern sensibilities, but yet things that would be issues of the time as well. You've got some of the overtones, and you see it represented in the older depictions a bit to where there's bullying, but this really goes into, here's some of the bullying in a small town. Here's what can happen. And in later episodes, there's issues with both a closeted gay character as well as some issues of being rumors and things like that, and how that can affect especially young women, as you put it, just things like that. So yeah, some issues that and it's funny to me, people sometimes have a problem with that kind of thing, saying like, oh, we're putting our modern values. And it's this one, I think they actually pull off really well, showcasing, here's people existed back then, by the way, and they, had to, they had to work with things they had in a time that, was not always friendly to that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the other things that I really appreciate, speaking to the bullying aspect of the series, is there's a lot of really great montages of all of the carrots scenes throughout the Anne of Green Gables adaptations of, her eventual love interest pulling her hair and whatnot, and her, slamming the chalkboard on his head and all that
Yeah.
stuff. And it's great to see the evolution of that scene throughout time, right? Where the thing that I think is so interesting about the current Anne with an E, or this version Anne with an E, is that you get to see that sort of bullying done in a way that feels so visceral and so real for so many kids of that age, and definitely feels more like that for me than, the 80s miniseries did, or the 1934 movie did, or even the anime did,
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. And it also, it is something that's interesting too, is the way that she plays it with Anne is, well, I don't know. It's a character. Let's just say the way that Anne has been portrayed, and I think the ones that I've seen have followed through on this, but particularly this one shows Anne as someone who, it's not so Pollyanna-y, if you will. She does have this over positive storytelling. Everything's beautiful, but you get this real sense of trauma, and that's actually throughout this whole series. I think that they've used trauma very effectively in storytelling, which we're seeing more and more in a lot of modern storytelling, is a trauma-informed approach to telling stories. But you get those PTSD symptomatic moments with Anne.
Yeah.
And I think, and we're going to, we'll delve right into episode 1. And I will say, it's not really a spoilery type of show, but there's not really a lot of surprises or anything like that, especially if you're, like most people, somewhat familiar with the source material and the older versions. But we're not going to hold back from anything in the show. I mean, we'll just go for it.
Yeah. Well, and the thing I would like to add to that, though, that's really interesting is, while if you have watched other versions, you're going to be very aware of like the famous moments of the story that they're shown in this. A lot of the later seasons actually deviate quite extremely from the source material, particularly when it comes to like certain side characters and where they go and on adventures that were never in the books, So obviously we won't touch upon that this episode or whatnot, but I definitely think that that's what makes Anne with an E also super intriguing, is the way that they organically flesh out these characters in new directions that weren't in the original source material.
Which I think makes a reboot more interesting.
Oh, yeah.
It's like when you watch, and anybody who's listened to this show knows I'm a big fan of like the MCU movies and things. And
same.
And one of the things that, I see people all the time saying things like, oh, well, it wasn't faithful to the comic completely that it was based on. And it's like, I don't want it to be. I want it to be its own story. And it's nice that it takes, impressions from the books. But it's like, this is its own thing. So it's allowed to be its own thing. And there is one, I won't mention what it is today, but there is one in particular thing that I think anyone who's a fan of the old material is like, oh no, I know it's coming. There's a big sad thing coming that never happens. Which I loved that it didn't happen.
Same
here. Perspective.
Because that's one of the things I also really appreciate about the show, which we'll get into with this episode, but the creative team on this show, which some of them actually worked on Breaking Bad, have a really interesting insight to the Anne sphere. And I think that they make choices that to some might seem like sacrilegious, but to others, I think is just a really refreshing change to the material. And the thing that we are hinting at is definitely one of those things I appreciate. Because it's like, oh, I don't need to see that again.
Especially when you think they might do it in a whole different way, and you're like, oh no.
Oh no.
So we'll go there. So with this, and I'm gonna, this episode right away also hits with PTSD flashbacks. I mean, Anne clearly has been through lots of trauma, which is not ever. I don't know that I've ever seen it highlighted before in the way that it is here. She actually goes through. In the midst of her storytelling and some of the things that she talks about to make things more beautiful and lovely, she will have these periods where she's triggered. There is an external trigger, and she gets that, some people call it a 1,000-yard stare, or that glassy-eyed look of just, I'm in here now. I'm in my head now. For audio, I just pointed to my head. So, I'm living internally for a moment, and there is a flashback. For the purposes of some narrative, it's a literal flashback where we see the scene that it came from so we can understand it. Many people in real life just experience a flashback to the emotions, not always memories, but anyway.
Right. It's not always the Ratatouille eating the food scene, of like going back and having this wonderful scrumptious memory. It's actually something pretty traumatizing.
That is the thing that makes Ratatouille for me, to be honest. It's not one of my favorite Pixar's, but that moment is like, it's worth the whole movie just for that one moment.
Same.
Yes, no, exactly. And, she remembers in the orphanage, the orphanage being abused by the other girls, being pushed around and also ridiculed for some of the things that she does to cope with the trauma, right? The storytelling and the different things like that. Obviously, also, she has been in service to families. And it showcases the fact that there's been abuse in that case as well from some of the families that she stayed with. There's obviously physical abuse and also just being overworked and put into these crazy situations of being like, you're the caretaker for 5 children, you 10-year-old, 12-year-old kid or whatever.
Yeah. And I think also these scenes do a really good job of foreshadowing and setting up the complicated relationships that Anne has, particularly with women in this show, because in other iterations of Anne of Green Gables, we don't really get to see so much of the conflict she has with a specific gender of characters. She, for the most part, has like kind of a duality of both having troubles with men and women. But I find it particularly interesting that in this show, because she doesn't have a really great maternal figure throughout her whole life, she has a lot of conflict with the female characters that she meets for the first time, like whether it be, her eventual family or it be the girls at school. There's a lot of internal conflict that she has. And I think the scenes, particularly in the orphanage with those young girls that throw certain animal things towards her.
Yeah, like a dead rat or whatever. That they, yeah. Well, and that also, that's a really good point. And I think that's what makes some of the relationships, obviously, with Marilla and obviously later with Miss Stacy, right? And those kinds of things. Of course, by that time, she's probably been through some healing, but it makes them more powerful. But it also makes sense to where she takes so quickly to Matthew. And
right.
There's a couple things. One of the greatest relationships, not just in this show, but in this story, right, is between her and Matthew. There's almost automatically a friendship and a fatherly influence, a father-daughter relationship, if you will, that emerges pretty quickly.
The Broken Brain.
And now, a message from our sponsor.
You've had it happen before as a therapist. Somebody you're working with is working through trauma, maybe complex trauma, and maybe you've been working with them and they're having some progress, they're having some results, but they're struggling and you're worried about them and you're not really sure what to do. Well, EMDR is a way to go. I know you've heard of it, you're a therapist, but eye movement desensitization and reprocessing therapy is sweeping the field and has been for quite a while now as an evidence-based treatment. And, my friend Chris Revel, who comes on the program quite a bit, has talked on this program and other podcasts about how his complex medical trauma, where he almost lost his wife and daughter in childbirth, kicked his butt over and over and over again until he was able to get some EMDR therapy, and he does not have those symptoms anymore. So it's such an exciting thing. That's one of the reasons why I have had a sponsor come on the show. Carol Miles and Viviana Triana are trainers and social workers who train mental health professionals in EMDR. You can get EMDR certified by going to their trainings, which are online and easily accessible. You can get your continuing education credits as well. We are having a phase 1 training coming up September 7th through the 9th, and I'll be joining you as a student, as well as having them sponsor the podcast here. Phase 2 training is also coming up in October. They also have an option for those who have studied, who have done some EMDR in the past, but need a refresher to come in and audit the program for a fraction of the cost as well. And you'll see that when you go to carolmiles.com and click on trainings. When you register, there's different options for students, for working professionals, and for those who just need to audit and pick up the tips and tricks and things to help them get back on it, particularly focused on working with children. So very, very exciting, and looking forward to meeting you, myself, there at the training. Sarah Galloway, who is one of the folks over at Mental Health Value, an apparel, art, and others things company that supply all kinds of cool looking and awesome things. We were able to chat, and she gave me a deal on something on their website, anything really, and I'm passing that deal on to you. mentalhealthvalue.com is the website for a small startup company focused on spreading good thoughts and good feelings about mental health. You can get shirts, you can get an art print, we can get all kinds of things. They donate a portion of their sales to different mental health charities, primarily focused on NAMI. If any of you are familiar with NAMI, the National Alliance on Mental Illness, that's legit. That is a wonderful organization. We've talked about it on the program before. And gosh, way back when, we had a suicide prevention training by one of their employees who came on the show. So that's definitely a good cause. You can feel good about what it is that you're getting. Personally, I used my 25% off code that I'm going to share with you here in a minute to buy an art print, the Lose Your Mind, Find Your Soul art print. You can find a picture of that as the banner art for this episode, and I'll put a link to it as well. I love the picture. It's hanging here in my office. I'm looking at it now as I'm recording. So you also can get 25% off, whether you're looking for apparel, whether you're looking for some jewelry, some art prints, things like that. Gosh, I have the website in front of me, and there's a Be Kind to Your Mind that I'm seeing there right next to the art print that I got that I may pick that one up as well. The code is MENTAL25. That's all one word, MENTAL25. And that'll be good for a week or so for Brainiacs to hop on there and use that. So make sure to get over there, mentalhealthvalue.com, and check that out. Great deal. Thank you to Sarah and the folks at Mental Health Value for making that deal available for all the Brainiacs out there.
Marilla is much more the leader. Like, she is much more the authoritative energy in the household. So it makes sense that Matthew, being the more submissive and more calm figure between the two of them, is the one that connects more with Anne instantaneously. And I think that works so well with their dynamic because of Anne being so much of a talker and Matthew being so calm and quiet. And that duality is very well portrayed between all three of the characters in this first episode.
You can really see them bouncing off of each other. And as I mentioned trauma earlier, you've got three people, all of whom are highly traumatized, I would say, by some of their experiences, both things that lack in Marilla and Matthew's experience that just never happened for them. Maybe the estrangement from society a bit, from being a brother-sister, never married, that their childhood, it gets into. So they're walking around with their own trauma, and Anne is now introduced with her trauma in a completely different way. Stoicism is not the way that she is coping as it is for the two of them.
Yeah.
One of my favorite moments is during the pickup from the train. Once again, we're watching for those classic things, and here's Anne being left, and of course, Matthew and Marilla have adopted a boy, they think, to help around the farm and to possibly live with them. And when he picks her up and gets her in the little buggy, he's, of course, just kind of blown away, like, I don't know what to do. This girl, I guess we'll just go home. I can't leave her at the train station, for crying out loud.
Yeah.
Obviously. And as they're going, she is just going on and on and on about different things of how beautiful it is. Here's her imagination, all this. And he's completely just stone silent through this. And I love the little exchange where she says, "Am I talking too much? Adults always tell me that I'm talking too much."
Yeah.
And then he says something that she may have never heard before from an adult, which is, "I don't mind. I like it," you know?
Yeah, which is a fantastic play off of their relationship and a great setting off point for where they're going to go as the show continues on.
You could say the major coping skill that Anne has with the world around her and with her trauma is that she tries to be very optimistic. One of the real showcases of this that I wanted to get your reaction to is her tendency to rename things. She will rename them either after literature or things that she thinks are romantic or dramatic or beautiful. And she'll relabel everything around her, like this grove of trees is now the awning of beauty, or I don't remember the exact term she used. What are some of your thoughts about the way she names things?
First of all, I connect a lot with Anne as a character in every adaptation because I, as a neurodivergent person, have often seen the world in a similar sort of fantastical, optimistic, and fantastic-y fantasy way, all the words. I absolutely was someone that would rename things that were ordinary so that they could be more grand and magical and romanticized so that, my kind of humdrum life would seem more just epic and grandeur and whatnot. So I absolutely think that that is a beautiful thing that she does. And again, the actress Amy Macbeth does an amazing job of making that text have more life in it that, any other actress might have done in a very kind of plain way.
There's a term, disassociating, for anyone who's familiar with that out there. And it's interesting because you see different versions of this. There's as we mentioned before, the glassy-eyed stare pulling inside. In trauma, they talk about how we have a fight or flight response, but nowadays it's a 4-part response. There's fight, flight, freeze, or fawn, or friend is another term for fawn. And you can see actually some of these played out. Fight, flight, freeze, and friend are things that you can see and, doing in such case. I feel like, there's the classic disassociation that we recognize where she pulls inward and shuts down and freezes. I feel like to a certain extent, some of her renaming and some of the things where she is totally living in the fantasy it's a little disassociate-ish, if you will. She's not fully present sometimes because there are times where embellishing and imagining and all that, she doesn't get the social cues that it's not the best for that situation. But sometimes there's times where it's clearly worse for the situation, but she'll do it anyway. Right. So there's a compulsion kind of, or she slips. I'm giving a lot of different terms that don't always equate to each other here. Compulsions, disassociation, detachment, not being socialized properly. That she's got this whole cocktail of things that will push her into I'm going to say this embellishing thing. It doesn't matter if I'm only with one other person and they don't like that.
Yeah, no, it's so true. And, that's actually a lot of the terminology that I've thought of in regards to the things that she says towards other characters, especially in these first 3 episodes, I would say. Especially when she's talking to her eventual best friend in the show, which I think is what makes so many people, including Diane, so attracted to her because of these fantastical ways that she describes things and essentially disassociates from the troubles of real life,
I'm trying to, I rewatched it for this and then we hadn't recorded for a little bit. I had watched the first couple actually, and I'm trying to remember if Diane makes an appearance in the first episode. I think
she does.
She does. That's where we meet Diane.
Yeah.
Agent Olivia from Odd Squad. Anybody who's watched that with their kids or whatever.
I haven't watched that. Okay.
Odd Squad is just a fantastic children's show that's made by actually the Mr. Rogers Corporation or whatever they're called, Mr. Rogers Foundation, where they have the premise is that there's a group of kids that are these like secret agents that correct things that are weird, and of course they use like reasoning and sometimes math and things. But it's way better than those kinds of shows when we were kids. But anyway, not to go off on a
I love that, though.
total Odd Squad tangent, but someone who got her acting chops obviously in children's television as well. Really good, really good actor. And yeah, they you're right. They just right out of the gate, Anne is just like, we could be bosom companions. And that intensity, you also get the idea that Diane, living a very sheltered life within one of the more wealthy families within Avonlea, that she is, sheltered and hasn't really had an opportunity for a friend, especially one that's going to be anyone in her life who's been so frank and upfront.
Yeah, exactly. And I think the thing that's so interesting about Diane is how she's kind of the epitome of a lot of American Girl characters that I grew up with as a kid in books. And I'm sure that they are based on her, since obviously, Diane existed in pop culture first. But it's so funny to see the way that is adapted in this particular show, with like the rigid way that her family looks at the way she has to live, and how she can't have her own identity, and she needs to, stay within these parameters. And I think Anne really kind of checks this box or clicks this button for her that unleashes her imagination and shows that she can be this incredible person, but be flawed and not be within the parameters of what her family wants her to be.
And it's very interesting how I feel like the show does a good job of, there's a change, there's an arc to many of these characters, but for many of them, they do maintain these parameters, because Diane, to some extent, in the life of the series, her story does have certain rigidities that she bumps into that is like, okay, this is a bridge too far. I can't quite go here. Or whatever, as the series evolves, but she is challenged and brought out of that shell very much by this very healthy relationship with Anne, who, even though Anne's got all this stuff going on in her life, you can also see where for the time she also was quite, I'm going to say healthy, because talking about things is quite healthy, right?
Yeah, well, and one of the things I love about Anne in particular in this episode is how she sticks up for herself. Like, especially during the episode's very intense final moments involving a certain jewelry item, she definitely tries to, stand as someone who knows her rights, knows who she is, and that like she isn't all these things that people have associated with B because she's an orphan.
Absolutely. No, it is when she yells at Marilla's best friend, or when she is pushy, and she does what she needs to do to try to survive. But also there is a strength and intensity to where I think you see this in children and in people who they're not used to people standing up for them. No one else is going to do it. And even when she's sure, like, oh, okay, you're going to kick me out now. Also, really cool is that you see her having this life experience when she jumps right off the buggy, for example. This is the time where she first impresses Marilla when they're traveling and the horse goes crazy. She jumps out of the buggy and actually takes a hold of the horse and is like not scared. And you get the idea that this is definitely something that other kids around would not know how to do. Which, to someone who is the practical stoic that Marilla really is, she takes to that right away and says, "Oh, wow, you're quite handy with you weren't scared at all. You didn't like she might expect that some of the little girls or young girls around that area might be, because once again, the Dianes who are socialized to be like, oh, yeah."
It's so true. And especially when, in the beginning of the episode, when Marilla and Anne first meet, she says, oh, I can do the things that the boys do here on the farm. Like, why are you making the assumption that I can't do it just because I'm a girl? And it's great to have that scene of that horse moment play out, because then Marilla does get the proof that she can do the things that anybody on the farm can do. regardless of their gender.
Yes. Yeah, and that's where she pitches in to say, well, you need me to be a boy? Oh, whatever. I'll do boy stuff. I'll do whatever you need me to do if you will let me stay. And it's one of the things that it might be interesting to touch on here at this point is Matthew and Marilla's relationship, as you mentioned before. Of course, they are brother-sister, neither married or ever really moved out of the farm at all. And they both have just had this experience of running this farm together. So at the same time that they are brother-sister, there is this practical sort of couplehood, this co-team management that they have to have of their home and their resources. They have a household together, right? And you see, as you put it, Marilla's in charge, and Matthew is more than willing to sit back and be like, yeah, you're in charge. And especially if that means I don't have to talk to anybody.
Right. And the thing that in particular I find really fascinating is it almost seems like Marilla has always been in this show the leader, the dominant force. Yet when she's with Rachel, who is her contemporary, who is a similar but very different sort of antagonistic energy, she kind of becomes more of a wallflower. And she kind of becomes a little bit more like, fading into the background compared to Rachel, who is this very, prominent, fancy woman of the town and a gossip monger and all this stuff, And I just think that duality in those relationships that are so important to Marilla is so fascinating.
There's an old saying that I heard once about family, and I'm going to apply it to a very small, tight-knit community. And I think anybody who has a big family or has lived in a small town or maybe grown up in a tight-knit, maybe religious community or whatever community that you've been a part of, I think we can identify with this. But the saying is that it's kind of like getting in an elevator with a bunch of strangers and then never getting off. Right. And so I've often thought this about the Rachel and Marilla relationship is Rachel often Marilla tolerates Rachel sometimes, or there's a big eye rolling, kind of thing, but yet they're best friends. And part of that might just be that there's no one else around. And that sometimes, even though that sounds like a negative statement, one of the things that does is it forces you to see the good in someone if you're going to talk to them at all, right? If you're not going to be alone, basically.
It's so true. And you can tell that she sometimes is at her wit's end with Rachel, that she just cannot stand her. Right. And that Rachel is so the opposite of Marilla in that, she does her hair in a certain way. She has more luxurious clothes and she thinks more about the appearances of people and how that is a big factor to her. And I think that's what also really makes the very iconic moment of her and Anne facing off against each other and the appearances being a very important thing to Rachel. Just makes such a huge impression on the audience. At least it does to me.
Absolutely. Well, and that's one of the times where Anne's way of coping with something is counter to her survival in a way, if you will, because many people just be like, well, I'll just take it. And she's just like, no. And the other thing that I think is very fascinating is that in those practical matters, you saw where, Matthew is, of course, just like, yeah, Rachel Lynn sucks. I mean, you can tell he's just like, I don't care. But Marilla, one of the interesting things is you see a divide between them in that relationship with the issue when she thinks Anne stole and lost the brooch, right? That's a personally hurtful thing to her. But her reaction to, Anne's like, you're going to kick me out now that I yelled at your friend. And she's just like, no. That's not, and I, she even tells Rachel, it's like, she was right, kind of. I mean, she doesn't say it that way, but, she stands up for her, which is very interesting to me. Here's someone she has no reason to have affection for right away necessarily, but she's like, you were mean to her and she doesn't know how to act. What did you expect?
Right. And also I love that Marilla even acknowledges that Rachel is a problematic person in that moment. And it's kind of like, yeah, she is kind of a like not great Like,
And
so
they never say this, and maybe it's subtext. I don't know what the actor's intention was or the director, writer's intention, but I get a vibe there that maybe Marilla's a little pleased to see someone take Rachel down a peg.
absolutely. Well, and I definitely can speak to the fact that I've had friendships where I've been friends with people that are a Rachel, we can say. And there are moments where you just are like, you end up kind of accepting them for their quirks, right? But as you get to see these other people there, these new energies come into the middle of the friendship, and they're a lot more, they don't have as much of the baggage that you do within that friendship. And they're able to say a lot more honest things about that friend that has those not so great tendencies like Rachel does. It's something that I was like, yeah, I relate to that immensely.
So one of the things that is really big is at the end of course, which sets us up for and we may, talk about the second episode at a different time, because that's one of my favorite actual episodes. We'll get into why.
So good.
But it sets it up for where she's getting sent back because of the supposed theft of the brooch, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the interesting thing to me is that scene where they are leaving, and of course Matthew has to take her to the train, and he is just heartbroken, kind of pissed. I mean, there's all these feelings, and of course he does not. Once again, these characters have parameters, and I think a lesser show would start breaking the parameters, whereas to a certain extent, some of the parameters are never broken. His personality is not verbose, right? He's not going to say, here's how I feel about that. He's going to say, at most, a little snippet like, seems a shame,
right.
In a way. And you can almost tell where that's even more cutting. Marilla's like, I know what it takes for him to say that.
Because he's a man of few words.
Oh, absolutely. But I get the idea. It's interesting to me. You've got these three people who are all heartbroken. Marilla feels betrayed, doesn't know what else to do, but she's also sad. And then, of course,
right.
Anne is devastated by this concept, and angry at being presumed guilty.
Yeah, and the thing is that in addition to everything that you said, when you think of the relationship that Anne has already established with Matthew, where he would most likely believe that she didn't do anything that was bad intentioned with the brooch, and her and Marilla still haven't established that sort of connection yet, even through all these moments that we discussed about earlier. It's, again, another example of how Anne and many of the female characters have this sort of interesting, conflict and friction between them. And that also societally, it's a very interesting commentary about how most people think about orphaned or foster kids. And that, they must be, doing things like stealing things so that they can make money, or, trying to backstab other people. And that's an awful thing to think about someone that's in that, life perspective.
There's speaking of the mental health side of things, there's also what they call a disruption in attachment, where somebody who goes through neglect or trauma, oftentimes those that are orphaned and don't have a loving upbringing, they have a hard time attaching. Like, you're supposed to learn that as a baby, that I can attach safely to people. And it's a spectrum. Everybody has a different strength, a different what they call security or insecurity of attachment, right? And so you've got that sort of thing, and the way that it emerges on people when it is disrupted and problematic is usually one of two ways. You usually have someone who pushes everyone away, or you have someone who pulls everyone in and desperately tries to attach. And I think you see both in different, to some ratio. But with Anne, she's very much the type that tries to attach to people and then is, susceptible to rejection because of that, I think. And so there's a deep hurt that she feels here that we'll see goes on to damage the relationship with Marilla in the short term.
Absolutely. And the thing that's also interesting in regards to rejection, like you mentioned, is that, so as I said, I'm neurodivergent, and there's a very big thing with people who have ADHD that's called rejection sensitivity dysphoria. And I can't help but notice that Anne has some things kind of related to that, especially in that scene and in other moments of her having that huge feeling of the impending rejection. A great example is in the first episode when she's at the dinner table, when she knows that she's not going to be able to stay there. And she's like, I just can't eat the food because sorrow. And even though that's a much more like comedic and melodramatic interpretation of RSD, I can't help but feel like it's very applicable to that, you know?
Because there are those moments of extremity. I have ADHD and bipolar as well, or ADHD as well, and then bipolar disorder. And yes, there are those moments where even looking back on your own moments of depression, suffering, mania, whatever, detachment, rejection, all those, there are times where I can look back and even go, oh, geez, you know, I was really dramatic in that moment. And, you know, I was losing a fight with a cupboard or a salt shaker. That was pretty, you know, whatever that was.
Right.
And so, yeah, I think it is realistic to have those moments too, where you almost want to laugh, even though it's also very sad, you know?
Right.
There's this anticipatory rejection. She knows it's coming, even when it isn't. She knows, I'll say, she anticipates that it's coming. And the interesting thing is, it's not without merit. It's not just a delusion. I mean, if your child steals or loses a family heirloom, you're angry, you're hurt. It might even damage the relationship, but you don't get rid of them, right? You know, and it is a different situation. It's like, if you're going to come in and steal, then I can't, whatever. But there's a commitment there. And once again, in Marilla's defense, they have not made that commitment at this point. They have not said you're adopted. You're just staying here on a trial basis. So not to pick on her. However, for someone who's like, everyone's going to get rid of me. If we do any eye rolling to that, I think we have to stop and understand that doesn't come from not being rejected. You know, even if it's amplified, you know,
it comes from years and years of being in these very toxic situations of, you know, her being in these families that have taken her in, but only use her for work and, you know, have never truly given her any signs of genuine affection or love. And, you know, she always feels like, to use a phrase I like to use a lot, she's always the bridesmaid and never the bride. You know, like she always is, you know, never taken in and genuinely given the love that she has always dreamed of, and thinks that in many pieces of fiction with orphans tend to do, thinks that, you know, her birth parents would have given her.
Yes, absolutely. Well, we're just drawing up on our time for today, and this has been super fun to be able to talk about. We are going to make this a recurring thing on the show where we're going to go through this series. And of course, Dalin, you are more than invited to jump on for this. I think
Thank you.
Having people that are really passionate about the subject that we're talking about is one of the, I hope, hallmarks of the show, and that is something that I try to do all the time. So hopefully, you know, we will be back again soon to talk more about this. What can you tell people about where they can find you and your work? You mentioned your writing is out there.
Yeah, so you can definitely look me up on /film. I've been there for a really long time. I have lots of listicles that I'm doing all the time. I'm currently writing a piece about Don Bluth, which is really fun.
Oh, fun. Like touching on Fievel or...
touching on American Tail, Rockadoodle, Thumbelina, all the stuff. I'm ranking all of his theatrical release movies, which is great.
Did he make All Dogs Go to Heaven also? Is that another Bluth?
He did. Yeah, he did. So I'm working on that. And you can also find me on Twitter. I'm at It's Really, but it's REEL Dalin.
Like movies. Right.
Yes.
Very cool. Great. You know, I always ask everybody who comes on the show, especially the first time, if they have any charities or nonprofits that are meaningful to them that they'd like to share with people and tell people to go find, pledge money to help out.
Absolutely. So I'm a really big fan of theme parks. And because of that, I have a huge love and obsession, admiration for Give Kids the World, which is a very cool organization that helps kids in a sort of Make-A-Wish style foundation get to go to Disney World and other Orlando-based theme parks during a very tumultuous time in their life, and also gets to give them a really cool house and place to stay in that's themed to magic and Disney and whatnot. But it really allows for families that are in really not so great situations to get to experience the magic of theme parks. So.
Fantastic. I'd never heard of that before. There's a lot of the charities that we have, are ones you kind of heard of, or at least the cause. I didn't know that was happening at all. That's fascinating.
It's really cool. And I actually am going to a charity Disney convention that they're doing later on this year. So highly recommend it.
Well, I just want to put one thing out there. Of course, we're sponsored by Three Rivers Training, our new sponsor. There were details in the announcement earlier, the ad earlier about how you can sign up for EMDR trainings for clinicians and people working in the mental health field, and trying to promote that as well. Also, real quick, I want to mention to everyone that I'm going to be doing a multiple-hour live broadcast on August 31st, and that's going to be for opioid overdose awareness and the fentanyl epidemic that we've been facing for the last couple of years. And so what that's going to be is I'm going to be broadcasting over a StreamYard link. If you don't know what that is, it doesn't really matter. It's just a platform for live streaming. They don't let you plan more than a week or they don't let you set it up more than a week in advance. So I don't have the code yet, but I'm going to release a link where people can join me live on the StreamYard if they want to. You can also comment if you follow on the social medias that I'll give you here in a second. But if you want that link, anyone is welcome to join throughout that time. I'm hoping to get it going for 4 or 5 hours worth of people joining and me talking about different things that have to do with opioid awareness, opioid abuse awareness, and what to do about that in our culture. It's really, really important. So please jump on. You can go to facebook.com/breakabrain. You can go to Twitter @breakabrain, or go to Instagram @brainiacs ahoy. Those are our social media outlets for the show, and that's where you can find that and eventually find the link to join. Or if you follow any of those places, you can, especially Facebook and anyway, you can follow those places to make comments online as well. So that's something we're looking forward to. August 31st, midday, going to be going on. Hope everyone will tune in and join. Once again, everybody within the sound of my voice is invited to join, no matter what your level of expertise or experience is with drug abuse. Happy to hear stories, happy to hear insights and thoughts, or if it's just something you care about and you just like to add your voice. So please join us for that. Well, Dalin, until next time, thank you so much for
absolutely.
Thank you for listening to the Court Arts Podcast Network. To listen to more Court Arts shows, visit courtemparts.com.